So, as artificial intelligence rapidly expands across public and private domains, our personal data is increasingly becoming the collateral. From facial recognition technologies at airport to surveillance cameras at every public street, and our data being scraped from the internet to train large language models, no aspect of our lives remain untouched. While it's clear that AI is here to stay, through this panel, we try to explore how privacy is being redefined in the AI era and how to strike a balance between innovation and user rights in this AI powered digital landscape. For this, I welcome today's moderator, Mr. Prashant Sugadan, who is the legal director at SFLC.in. Prashant has worked on issues ranging from data protection to open source software license compliance. He has appeared in many landmark cases before various tribunals, high courts, and the Supreme Court of India. Prashant has also spoken at various national and global conferences on technology, law, privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. We also have with us today Ms. Namrata Maheshwari, who serves as the Senior Policy Counsel and Encryption Policy Lead at Access Now. She leads Access Now's policy and advocacy work across South Asia. She also leads the organization work on encryption policy globally. Previously, she worked with Center for Digital and Technology as a consultant. Namrata is an Indian qualified lawyer enrolled with the Bar Council. She completed her LLM from Columbia Law School and um, prior to that from Jindal Global Law School. We also have with us Mr. Dr. Gus Hussain, who is the Executive Director of Privacy International, a London based charity that works with partners across the world to advocate for legal and technological solutions to protect people and their data from exploitation by governments and companies. He has worked at the intersection of technology and human rights for over 25 years. Mr. Gust has held visiting fellowships at the London School of Economics, Columbia University, and University College of London. He holds a Bachelor of Maths honors from University of Waterloo and PhD from the University of London. Over to you all. Over to you, Prashant.
Thanks, Angela, for the introductions. Sorry. We have two great speakers today, as seen from the introductions given by Angela. Before we start, we find that AI is the buzzword now in this transforming businesses and also our interactions on a daily basis. However, the growing definitely from a human rights perspective, particularly with regard to privacy. As AI systems collect, analyze, and infer data about individuals, the potential for surveillance, profiling, and data misuse expands significantly. And especially if you look at it from an Indian context, we still don't have a data protection law in practice. We have a law, but it's not yet enforced. And even with the law as such, there are a lot of loopholes and which could result in various AI systems misusing our data, misusing how that information getting profiled and used for various purposes and also for surveillance. So these are some things which I would like our panelists to discuss today. The way we will structure this is we will have introductory remarks from both the panelists, and then we will have a series of questions. To be like more like a free conversation. To start with, over to you, Gus. If you could have your introductory remarks.
Thanks so much for having me today and giving me the opportunity to learn and engage on this topic. And I say that, when you say the bio, you read off that I've been in this sector for 25 years. It makes me feel a little old, but it also, every time I'm engaging in this field, I feel like it's day one all over again. Like even so all those years ago, I got into this field because of encryption policy. And yet every day encryption is a new issue that we're dealing with. And that's certainly the case with AI as well. In that for decades now, we've been wondering, what is it about automated decision making? What is it about profiling? After 9/11 in America, automated decision making was the solution to identifying all the terrorists. But then eventually that idea dried out. And then a few years later, big data came as the profiling solution. And eventually that idea dried out. And now it's AI, and AI does have this staying power. And I feel like, again, I'm at step zero, learning what are the systems that are being deployed? How do they work? What is the data going into them? What is the data coming out of them? And trying to make sense of it. And so sessions like these really help me because while I spend a lot of time reading, and I occasionally even ask the LLMs themselves to explain themselves to me. I think it's through these types of conversations that we can start to make sense of what's going on and what's needed as we step forward. So thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Gus. And over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Prashant. And just echoing what Gus said, thank you so much for organizing this. I really think that conversations are where we really learn because then you get to benefit not just from the one book that you are reading right now or the 5 meetings you're attending today, but the 50 meetings that everybody's attending and the 50 books everybody's reading. So thank you for this. I think in the context of AI, first of all, there's just been so much hype and so much buzz around something that all of us have at some level been grappling with for a long time. And that has made us and governments go from thinking about development of models and the safeguards that need to be baked in, conversations around those aspects, to very quickly around deployment and how do we just get this in the market? Where do we implement this? How do we bake AI into our governance systems? And that to some extent also reflects in the various AI summits that we've seen organized over the last 3 years. In South Korea, it was the AI Safety Summit. Then it became the AI Action Summit in France earlier this year, where again the focus went more clearly towards action. And early next year, India is hosting it as the AI Impact Summit. So that sort of acceleration is happening in some sense in a silo where processes are not as participatory as they should be. There very much is a centralization of power and contribution to what form this takes from companies and from governments. So I think one of the key challenges is to take a step back and see, as Gus said, right, a lot of times we are starting from day one, but there are a lot of issues here that we have already dealt with. AI, ultimately, privacy, what we're talking about today. So many of the fundamental rights that have been recognized since across the world are all grounded in privacy. So we do have very solid groundings across the board. And we need to see where to separate the hype from the need. Do we really need AI? Do we really need our artificial intelligence models to be dictating how our digital public infrastructure works, for example? So I think it's important to kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit with those questions. But of course, we have to be strategic about it in a way that we're aligned with the reality and pace of the outside world. And for India, particularly, since we often talk about India offering the fourth way. Prashant, you said we don't have a data protection law yet, right? We have it on paper, but it's not in force yet. So if we are to offer a fourth way separate from EU, US, and China, what does that look like? That's both an opportunity and a challenge. So privacy, I think, will be very much and should be at the core of these conversations. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Narmada. Gus, we'll start with the first question. I mean, if you look at the data protection laws across the world, one of the basic concept that we use is that of info. Is that kind of broken now? I mean, with the AI and the kind of data scraping which happens, and are there any alternatives to this?
Um, for again, just playing the old man card, for 25 years, I've been saying consent is a broken control. It's not the type of safeguard that we think it is, but also increasingly as our societies become digitized. And what I mean by that is that we're constantly generating data. There are sensors in our homes and in our cities and in our lives that are constantly generating data about us and the things that we do. The whole idea that I have a control over that data flow based on my consent is just it's been outdated for as long as we've had mobile phones. And what AI does to that is it sets it on fire. Let me be a little bit more specific when we talk about AI, because and I think in the context of this conversation, I'll take three aspects of AI. So because there really is no singular definition of what AI is. It is whatever the marketer who's selling you tech at a moment in time. That's what AI is. But if we look at it in the context of the things that worry us in this conversation, there's AI in the form of learning systems that potentially become generative systems. And these are the LLMs that everybody has started to get accustomed to engaging with, whether it is the LLMs from the Chinese or the American firms, or recently in the UK, we saw an LLM that was developed to process asylum requests so it's developed by the UK government, that they have their own model. Or just today, I read an article about Singapore having its own sovereign LLM, so that Singaporean citizens can engage with it. So the idea that these systems can learn and generate data, but they're learning from our data. And as you said, they were scraping their data to begin with. They're gathering it without our consent. And so consent already has been abandoned in that one. So that's the first type of AI. The second is the type of AI, and there's certainly overlap in these. There's AI that can identify patterns, draw inferences, and predict. And I use predict with great caution, because the idea that you can predict anything is mathematically unsound. But it doesn't stop people from thinking that you can predict the future based on past data. And we're seeing these types of systems being deployed usually where accountability is least, such as in policing. We have predictive policing systems being deployed, or as we saw with the war in Gaza, the use of AI systems to target attacks. And again, you can't quite understand where consent would play a role there when the data that is being used in those types of situations are telecommunications data. So the fact that your phone is connecting to a cell tower, you don't consent to that. That just happens as a condition of actually having service and being able to call. And then the last one, and then I'll stop talking, is I guess AI systems that are there to detect. And this is where you get into the world of computer vision, the fact that computers can now see and understand what they see and recognize what they see. And this is where we get into the world of facial recognition. And again, there's no consent when these systems are deployed on city streets or at borders. Consent just doesn't exist in those environments. And that's why we need to stop talking about consent and start talking about the democratic license for these systems to exist. And in the past, when we've talked about democratic license, we tend to talk about constitutions. We talk about individual rights and human rights and civil liberties and economic and social justice rights. Those are the types of things we need to be talking about in the context of these massive and different forms of AI systems.
Thanks, Gus. Yes, definitely. You're right. Consent is something, the concept as such is always broken, and we always have to look beyond consent to ensure that the rights of individuals, rights of citizens are protected. Namrata, coming over to you. You work a lot on. How do you see let's say, the challenge with AI? AI can, of course, be used to, protect the data in a much more secure way, maybe using encryption, but then it can also be used to break this easier with the kind of tools that are available now.
Yeah, I think in the context of AI, there are a few new challenges or new facets that we're seeing, right? The challenge of unrestrained data collection and how people retain control or autonomy over their personal information is something that we have been grappling with for decades. But AI adds a new frontiers to it, actually, multiple, and including in the context of secure messaging and secure storage. Um, But to look at the specific impact it has in the context of encryption or private messaging, I think the other layers of impact that AI has on the ecosystem are important to appreciate and map. And here I mean things like when we earlier looked at internet governance in the 2000s or even in the late 90s, there was this assumption that democratic liberal values were baked into the design of the internet, and therefore any kind of restraint, I mean, First Amendment was of utmost importance, safe harbor, all of those ideologies came about from this faith that internet will be an empowering force for democracy. To a great extent it was, but I think now the reality we are dealing with is dramatically different. So the point I'm trying to make there is that now, as opposed to looking at the internet as something that empowers people, and therefore how do we protect people's rights, we need to look at how certain technology or certain features need to be hard baked into services to ensure that people remain empowered and it is not left up to their choice. I mean, there was a time when getting the reject all cookies option in the context of GDPR, that was a big win, right? And that's true. At the time it was. But I don't think in today's day and age it is meaningful at all to place the burden entirely on the user. Our notions of what reasonable expectation or reasonably expected use or purpose limitation is, all of those things have changed. If I gave my consent to Facebook when I made my account 15 years ago, could I have expected that my profile picture and my wall or any content could be used for the purposes that it is being used for today? So there's a huge change in that. And again, in the context of encryption as well, my I think a lot remains to be seen, to be very honest with you. But at this point, my take is that AI and end-to-end encrypted systems are fundamentally incompatible, and there are two legs to this. One is in the sense that a lot of regions are asking for client-side scanning, where they will scan your encrypted messages before they become encrypted, so that illegal and harmful material can be contained. Now, these measures, including proactive detection, they implicitly rely on some sort of machine or some sort of algorithm to do the scanning, supposedly meaning that because nobody is seeing it and a machine is seeing your content, your privacy is preserved. That I think is fundamentally flawed. It is still a new kind of discovery of content that you're introducing into an end-to-end encrypted system. And there is simply no such thing as a privacy preserving surveillance tool, right? So that's one aspect of AI. And the second aspect of AI and end-to-end encrypted systems is the sort we're seeing on WhatsApp, right? There's now this Meta AI logo and training models where they use, to different extents, content within that end-to-end encrypted system to train their models. That again, I think, is fundamentally incompatible. One, there isn't enough information about how they keep it separate from end-to-end encrypted content. And in any case, I think it adds a window of data collection, hoarding of data, training of data that is supposed to be encrypted, which to my mind does hurt the privacy and security of an end-to-end encrypted channel. So at this stage, I do think that the two are fundamentally incompatible and should not be merged.
Thanks, Namita. Thus, one major issue that we are facing is it's not just the private sector. We also find a lot of government services being automated, a lot of AI being kind of pushed even in this, where citizens kind of interact on a daily basis with these services. So, as a citizen, I mean, layman, like, what is it that they can do to kind of wrest back control? Is there something that they can do, or is it like something beyond repair?
I don't. That's a really hard question. Like, I don't think it's beyond repair. It's that I think we can learn a lot with the way that the companies are deploying their AI tools because I think they're struggling and they're learning along the way. And I don't necessarily think they're coming at it with complete negative intent. And so it's interesting to see how they do it. So let me use the example of AI assistants. That is the idea that on your device, you can ask your device to do something for you, such as to tell you, let's say, tell me to book a reservation at a restaurant that you emailed me about last week. And so this system should be able to process that. And I think to a large degree, this is something that people want. And you can also imagine that this system could interface with government for you. Like, please renew my driver's license for me, rather than me having to go and get that processed in person. And just last week at Google's big annual conference, they went really heavy on these assistants because I think this is how they're imagining for most people AI will exist in the future. Because there's the AI that exists in the infrastructure, and that tends to be surveillance AI, which is what governments want. But I think the AI that's most innovative right now is this consumer-facing AI. But they're having a hard time building it because LLMs, see the systems beneath all of this, don't really pay much attention to the person who's engaging with them. Whether that is by design, because LLMs don't quite learn that way, but it's also because these systems are very process intensive, and so having the AI learn from me as I engage with it was actually quite hard. And you've seen companies like Apple struggle with this. And there's also the promise that they've made to us as consumers, we're not going to abuse your data. And so there are little agreements that they say that they're not learning from the interaction from my interaction with this AI assistant. And so that's really interesting that these companies have had to take those types of decisions. But now, based on, say, what Google announced last week and every other company's rushing, they want to change that. They want it so that these systems can learn more about you and behave as if they know you. But then you have the challenge that is the system at work on my phone, or is my personal system on the phone? Is it paying attention to what I'm doing all the time? And can I stop it from paying attention to everything that I'm doing? And it gets to the question of what data does the system have access to? And can we stop it from gathering some types of data, such as our payment mechanisms or photos of our children? But if it's recording all the time, then you don't have that control. And Microsoft fell into some really hot water about this about a year ago when they developed a system called Microsoft Recall, which took snapshots, like practically figurative snapshots on your device every few seconds. It basically watched everything you did and stored these snapshots in a database on your device. And they thought, well, that's good because we're not sending any of this data up to the cloud. We're just keeping it local. So we're respecting people's privacy. But researchers came along and said, actually, this is highly problematic. These snapshots are capturing vast amounts of data. Things that you probably would have forgotten about, it remembers many days later. It captures your credit card, any information you might have shared in a secret chat, any emails that you might have sent or received and deleted. They're all in this system and they're stored locally in your device, but not securely. So Microsoft got in a lot of trouble and has had to redesign that. So then we extend this example. I'm going to end at this point. We extend this example. Say you have a Microsoft assistant running, or a system like Microsoft's running on your device, and it's recording everything. And then your device gets stolen. What happens to all that data? Or your device gets hacked. What happens to all that data? Or you're passing through a border and the authorities want to have access to your device. All of a sudden, they have vast amounts of access to vast amounts of data, even though arguably these firms are trying to do the right thing. So these are the types of problems we're walking into when it comes to the industry doing it. And we know that when governments deploy their systems, they don't take any such care into consideration. They're always thinking, can I get more data? Can I do more things with it? And can we do it in secret? So there's a lot to learn from this moment in AI's current history.
Thanks, Chris. Definitely, yeah. See, the kind of use this data could all be put to, and the kind of profiling that could happen is definitely immense, and especially when the government does it. And Namrata, if you look at the Indian scenario, what is currently happening with large amount of uh, data relating to children getting captured, whether it is their educational data, whether it is their reading habits. For example, you have various schemes of the government, and like even you have scheme like I mean, there are positives to it, that there is like the one subscription model where you can get access to academic journals, etc. But then there's also the negative where you are being profiled. It can be seen like what the kind of books that you've read or repeated, what you were reading from your when you were a child to up to maybe your graduation and your post graduation, and that could really help in understanding the kind of person you are, and the kind of profiling that could be done, and everything that could come along with that. I mean, with the kind of issues that could happen, especially when about a student who is interested in politics and things like that. So, what do you think? Like, what are the various steps and various safeguards that should be there, at least when it comes to student data or children's data?
I think in the context of children, it's just all the harms that we already see with all of these systems being used, but far more insidious and far more damaging and long term, because you're dealing with data principals that do not yet have control over their data and by no means can foresee how that data could be used against them. So again, I'm no expert on child rights and children's data, but in the I do think there are severe overlaps, but there are a lot of challenges with respect to children's privacy because that also overlaps with safety. You do want them to have access to services online and for their growth and benefit. But at the same time, how do we very strictly limit what they are exposed to? And then there's the important question of who decides these limitations. I think even especially in the Indian context, we take it for granted that it would be the parent or the legal guardian. But we have seen time and time again that often they don't have the best interests of the child in mind. So we do need to come up with more sophisticated and nuanced understandings of how best to preserve children's data. In the context of AI, I think the challenges remain the same in respect of all the people who are affected by it, and especially the government using it. And I think oversimplification, maybe there are three key things to look at. One is transparency. For the last decade, I think there are governments around the world who've used algorithms to determine welfare benefits or to determine whether somebody is more susceptible to commit a crime. And a lot of times, these models have included children. The Dutch tax authority scandal, for example, they were using an algorithm to determine who was misusing the system to get childcare benefits. Or in Latin America, there was a system that predicted which teenagers were more likely to to go through teen pregnancies, and then they would design interventions before as a preemptive measure. So there are several examples of these extremely invasive, um, absolutely opaque technologies that nobody knew were being used that came to light much later. So one big thing is this whole transparency. There has to be some check, some public scrutiny around before deployment. It cannot be after the fact because even then there are huge questions around insufficient remedy. Can you really remedy the kind of losses that occur from these things, right? The second thing is a supply chain. I think anytime a government uses AI, it necessarily relies on private companies for infrastructure, for the coding, for the servers, for storing the data, and so on, right? And that only serves to centralize the power further in the hands of the government and companies. And this is again different, right? Earlier, when we used to talk about platform accountability, or even now in some contexts, the government is trying to engender that accountability. But I think in the context of data collection and using it for predictive purposes, there are government interests in co-opting the capacities of the companies. So the second is the supply chain management. We talk about digital sovereignty in so many contexts. We say we want our own stack, and it's not just us, it's many countries in the world. But which companies are providing cloud services, which companies are actually storing all this data for you, running the apps that you are providing. And often it will be one of those 10 companies that we hear about the most. So the second is the supply chain management. And lastly, regulation. There's absolutely no substitute for it. Um, we cannot rely on, in good faith, on the government's good intentions, right? The point of a policy is for it to work even tomorrow or today when there is a government that might want to misuse it in place. So the EU AI Act also, for example, does not go far enough in that it prohibits certain kinds of high risk uses of AI, but it certainly has more accountability for private companies than it does for the public sector. And the Dutch tax authority situation is just one example of many where the government has, in fact, used AI and algorithms to the detriment of people's rights. So I do think that there are some use cases where the use of AI has to be banned. We are not at a stage where everything can be allowed with audits and assessment. We're just not at a stage where that's feasible. So AI in warfare, for instance, something that Gus touched upon, there are some use cases that just have to be an absolute red flag, and there has to be a moratorium on those.
Thanks. Definitely, there are many use cases where there should be a complete moratorium. There should be a ban, right? That's like often. I mean, that's mostly. I think we have seen this a lot in India, where CCTVs are kind of equated with security. You try to have CCTVs in all public places. Now you have FRT on top of this, facial recognition on top of it, and that is like, I mean, we earlier talked about consent, and this is something like where there is consent is non-existent. You're like forced to, if you're going to a place, a public place, you are, video is stored, video is captured, stored for, you don't know for like how long. Uh, what is it that we can do about this? Is this one area where we should say like have like a strict no?
These are really hard questions. And at PI, we worked on visual surveillance for as long as I've been around. So like decades. And we've worked on facial recognition for the last 7 or 8 years, and we've struggled with the question of banning. And rather, because generally when we try to ban a technology, we found it doesn't ever end up the way that we hope. And so instead, the way we approach it is that we try to stem the tide of data. We try to stop the data from getting into these systems. And so, for instance, with facial recognition systems, how do they work? Like, so one of the firms that we went after was a firm called Clearview AI. And what they did is that they scraped the internet, just like the LLMs did. They scraped the internet, grabbed all these photos, and then built a recognition system from there. And we said, well, they're not allowed to do that. And so we took a complaint to regulators in 5 jurisdictions, and they all agreed with us that you can't do that. That's not allowable. And so the firm was fined, and the firm was told it must delete the data of all citizens of those 5 countries. So you can stop the data ending up there in the first place. And so now we're looking into, okay, so where do government facial recognition systems get their data from? This is where it gets a little trickier, because can the government grab its ID database and throw it into a facial recognition database and then use that to identify people? Or can it build a learning model by feeding it faces from a national database and then having a national facial recognition system? And so again, we're exploring what allows a government to take a database that was created for one very specific purpose, such as an ID system, a driver's license, a passport, and what permits them to take that data and process it for a completely different reason. And this is where we get to that fundamental safeguard of purpose limitation, which is a purpose of a system has to be tightly defined, and you can't just come along and just rewrite it and say now it's a system for facial recognition, when really it's a system for administering identification documents in order to get access to something, or or in the case of a passport or a driver's license. And so we're actually taking a case through what we hope ultimately is the European system, legal system, to revisit this. That hasn't been the reason I say revisit is that we had a success in 2008 when the European Court of Human Rights said that DNA could not be used without a lawful basis, without a very specific purpose of creating a database to, and then even the creation of the database, it cannot be used for future crimes in a way without tight safeguards. And so we're trying to update that 2008 decision for the era of artificial intelligence and predictive systems and algorithmic systems. And so the work ahead is a little different than just banning. It's about trying to find a way of stopping these systems from getting the lifeblood that they require to exist.
Namrata, coming back to the issue of encryption, see, we often suggest and propose end-to-end encryption as a solution to ensure that nobody can get access to your messages, to your systems, etc. What about the kind of threats that we are now facing with AI and the kind of uh, the way in which these systems could be used to exploit vulnerabilities and even get access to end-to-end protected systems?
We need to more and more start thinking and talking about quantum cryptography, because just stripping artificial intelligence bare of the marketing terminologies and phrases, ultimately it is very, very sophisticated statistical computing that we're seeing now. And those are only going to amplify the mathematical possibilities, and therefore the potential exploitations that might be possible against such systems. And so I think that's why we see the likes of privacy preserving services like whether it's iMessage, Apple, or Signal. They've already implemented post quantum cryptography to protect against the sort of save now, save now, harvest later, basically attacks where you just collect troves of data, which at this point might be encrypted, but you rely on the fact that in the future you will have the ability to decrypt that data. So I think those um, vulnerabilities are already in a place where they are playing out in the background, and we will sort of see the impact a few years from now. And so we should start preparing for it. And by we, I mean people who care about privacy, autonomy, anonymity, and security on the internet. And one of the ways to do it is this. So in that sense, yes, there is an element of statistical computing on both sides. And unlike with everything else, it's going to come down to how much we are able to win the fight for privacy. And for that, I think we need to more and more start going back to why privacy is important as a value in society, because a lot of the conversation now devolves into very technical aspects of privacy, right? So even the pieces that you read or conversations we have are around your privacy is important, therefore these should be the default text settings on your phone. That is very important, but I think equally important, especially in contexts like ours in India, is to reinforce the value of privacy as a value. Because I don't think we will get to a point where we are able to force companies and governments to bake security and privacy into systems without this push from the public. And we have heard this, right, Prashant, in the context of the data protection law as well. I have heard it n number of times to say, people say that people in India don't really care about privacy. And there was one op-ed, I don't recall the publication, but it said the only people in India who care about privacy are the people who also know what asparagus is. And I think that's not accurate. I think it's just that the public vocabulary is at a different stage and we need to rework that. So I think in some ways we need to go back, and in some ways we need to be thinking 5 years ahead. So and both things need to be happening at once.
Thanks, definitely. Yeah, we need to be thinking many years ahead. Yeah. So, You are right. Like Gus, you talked about like how we cannot have moratoriums on everything. We cannot have bans. But so when it comes to regulations, many of the companies, I mean, business houses, like their alliances have been pushing for mostly self-regulation. But I mean, at least the experience that we have had with self-regulation is it hardly works. Because so, what is your take on it? What is the kind of regulatory approach that government should go for, countries should go for?
There's no such thing as self-regulation. It is, and it's amusing to see the AI industry call for self-regulation when they exist because they drove over existing regulation. They were able to grab data before anybody noticed and train their systems, and now they want to make sure that they can continue to dominate. And this is where it gets interesting, because even if we did start regulating only now, if say we passed a new law tomorrow and started regulating conduct, it would only really stop new companies from getting in, and it would preserve the power of these old companies. And so that's why we need to prosecute. And I don't mean this in a legal way, because I'm, again, well, I haven't said this, but I'm not a lawyer. But that's why we need to hold these companies in this industry, and governments who do it as well. We need to hold them to account to the existing legal regimes that already can that they're already should have been held to account by. So EU law has existed for ages, and there's nothing new within the EU law that shouldn't have stopped some of these things from happening. Or we need to find, as I said in the case that we're pursuing, we need to find new ways to revisit these rules and say they are alive and well, and they need to be applied in this to against these systems now in these ways. But the catch is, it's not just the companies who are ignoring the existing regulations. I haven't followed the dynamics as much in India, but what I've seen in Western European and in North America, in those countries where their economies are not growing at the same rate, we've seen governments struggle to figure out how they can navigate inflation, cost of living generally, and the lack of economic growth. So they've latched on to AI as the solution. They want to bring AI into their economies to unlock untold, unthinkable amounts of growth, they say. And they want to get rid of anything that gets in the way of that. And so now we're facing an era of deregulation. So we have this irony where, countries like India are trying to get, well, people on this call are trying to get stronger protections in law, whereas those countries that have those protections in law are trying to water them down without even you don't need Sam Altman knocking on their door saying please get rid of these protections. You have governments who are keenly looking at getting rid of the administrative state in order to allow for growth. So we're at this really dangerous moment where we need regulation more than ever. We have regulation that's not being applied, and there's even calls to reduce regulation. And the end state is a more powerful government and a more powerful industry who need each other, who feed off each other, and a geopolitics that is confusing ever more on every single day. And I don't know how we navigate that future unless we stop the madness and actually dig deep and build strong land regulation.
Namrata, see, what about the Gus spoke about how women, especially countries from the global south, are trying to kind of welcome AI and get welcome AI companies. So, what are the kind of challenges, the unique challenges that the global south faces when it comes to AI and also regulation?
There's no denying that AI has become like the latest protagonist in the geopolitical main stage, right? All the countries are vying to be the next big data center, the hub for AI. There are at least 3 countries in the global majority that have used the exact terminology to say like this is the new hub for AI. So I think there's a lot of that vying for power that is again this often comes from countries that don't have the requisite frameworks that we need in place to ensure that AI is used for all its great promises and uh, doesn't and the harms are mitigated. And we either don't have data protection laws where we have them, they are inadequate. Our surveillance frameworks often date back to colonial eras, even where there have been changes, they are cosmetic. So, in that sense, I think as far as the cons are concerned, we are jumping ahead of ourselves to be part of a race. And that's not to say we should not be embracing AI. I think, again, that would be Luddite or that would be anachronistic. We need to be getting with the times. We need to be seeing what best we can do. But I think we also have to have a ear to the ground and see what we need to have in place in with our own contexts. We should not be rushing at the cost of kind of replicating the harms of the past in a dramatically more, in an exponential manner. Um, I think with the AI summit coming to India, I think it's very exciting. We'll see a lot of what the global majority is trying to vie for. Uh, Even though there are so many resources that the Silicon Valley mainly, and then many others have used from these regions. We've often not got the credit or the say that the global majority deserves, including in conversations that are happening at the international level. A lot of the executive orders and the declarations coming out of summits, including on AI, are either completely ignore the needs of the global majority or include them in a very tokenistic manner. So it's as important as it is to deal with our own domestic frameworks to strengthen them for the incorporation of AI. I think it's equally important to demand that we have a say in these international conversations. So again, I think similar to my previous answer, we're talking about doing two quite different things, but at the same time. But that given the pace at which things are developing, there is no other option. And even when we say we have a say at the table, I don't mean just the governments. I mean exactly the opposite. Especially from these countries, we should be making sure that we are taking into account the lived experiences of people, and that especially civil society, because in the domestic context, those voices tend to get muffled. And so we should find a way to kind of prioritize where those lived experiences and lessons are coming from. And there's no one way that's going to work. Again, what I said about the fourth way, I don't think there's any one solution to how we will come out with an AI governance model that works for everybody, including the global majority. And that's something that we should be mindful of and not be okay with whatever is proposed at the EU level and treat that as the gold standard. So there's a lot of work that we can do from within our regions to kind of fill that gap.
Thanks. Yeah, we have around 8 minutes now. Let's take questions from the audience. We have quite a lot in the chat box. Starting with Manish. Manish mentions mostly about kind of surveillance from the government side with issues like Aadhaar, that's a biometric ID, and how with AI the risk is infinite, not only in terms of surveillance but also with respect to control aspect. What is it that we can do to curb this? Yeah, can you? We discussed it a bit, but anything specific? It's mostly about the government surveillance.
Yeah. Do you want to go
No,
first?
No,
Okay.
you go first.
To me, the biggest thing is accountability, court decisions, and accountability on those decisions, and policy and legal frameworks, a complete overhaul. I think a lot of these limitations have to be very strongly contained in our laws the Aadhaar Act, the decision that came later. To give you an example, the Supreme Court decision, as everybody on this call knows, there were strict limitations on how Aadhaar can be used. Were they followed in practice? No, they are still not followed in practice. So that accountability is extremely flawed, that accountability mechanism in the context of the judiciary. In the context of the executive and legislature, we do not have adequate limitations in our laws. Our data protection laws, again, they give the government exceptionally wide discretion. There is a lot of strengthening of the strengthening of the government's discretion in terms of composition of committees, being able to access data, and so on. So I think all of this entire ecosystem, we need a full surveillance reform agenda for these things to stop being a threat. So it will not be about how do we contain the threats with the AI model. I think it's broader than that, and AI is part of that ecosystem. I don't think laws should be tech specific, except in very, very rare scenarios.
Thanks, Gus.
And I just add, like, perfect answer. The only thing I would add is that maybe we should see AI as an opportunity to get these frameworks in that have lacked momentum. It's like one of the reasons the US has constitutional safeguards was because I'm sorry, legal safeguards in national law was because of the rise of databases in the 1960s. The reason why Europe has controls over data is because of the rise of the concern around national census, or the rise of electronic commerce in the late 1990s. These are we look back upon these and think, well, those are cute ideas, but really the threat's much larger. But people at the time they focus in on a problem. They use that moment, that political moment, to say we need a legal safeguard. We need a national conversation about what kind of societies we want to live in and what kind of safeguards we need. And maybe AI, I'm sorry, not maybe AI is that opportunity again. When AI is about to come in, and an AI that we can't control because it tends to be controlled by companies in other countries, when it involves our data being used in ways that even our governments cannot foresee, this is a moment for everybody to be concerned and for us to reassert what kind of societies we want to live in. And I'm pretty sure the answer to those questions are similar to the ones that already exist, again, in constitutional documents, legal statements, and international human rights, and just get it revisited. Let's not see this as a threat, but see it as a huge opportunity.
The second question from Malik relates to the purpose limitation principle that you mentioned. He's asking to have something like user triggered single use codes to verify and approve individual instances of access to data. So something like that, what you mentioned, like if you're going to use it for something else, you need to get user, consent. Is that possible? When it comes to government, mostly.
In theory, it's possible, but and there are ways of encoding data with instructions to say this data shall not be reused. I think the way that this is where we're extending beyond my understanding of LLMs, but if you develop an LLM, let's say you've developed a model using data that was said to be only usable for the development of this model, it's easy to create a new model that learns from that model. The moment, and so constraining it through technical means is challenging. And so I would say, of course I would say this, but I think we do need the legal safeguards to actually do that. And then there's the point that there's two additional points. First, you don't always know which data is being used in order to train these models. And particularly when it's government, you don't usually have insight into where they're getting the data from that they're then feeding into an AI system. And second, and I think this is what the question was almost getting at, there are times that you do want your data to be the data that goes and gets learned. For instance, our website, Privacy International's website, is constantly getting hammered by AI bots that are being sent around by these big firms to scrape all the data from our website to put it into their models. We kind of want them to do that because we wouldn't mind if somebody asked a question about privacy. They would actually get our thoughts and our ideas. But these bots are vandals. They're just hammering websites around the world. There's got to be a way to control. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is there are moments when we do want our data to be involved. Meta is arguing that one of the reasons they want people to let their model learn from their chats is that the model can then learn from your language. It could learn from the way you talk, the local language you use, like say, some of the words that are unique to your friendship networks and whatnot. Government intelligence agencies want to do the same thing, but it's still an interesting idea, and we shouldn't try to ban all forms of learning. But the moment you open up a little bit, then you are allowing all forms of learning. So that's the fundamental challenge.
Just to very quickly add to that, I'm also thinking about the digital literacy angle, right? Even if this is practically doable and even desirable along with legal safeguards, I'm not sure in most places we are at a point where every individual whose personal data is accessed might be in a position to provide that informed, voluntary, free consent. So that's another thing. And I know we're yet to see how consent managers play out in the Indian context. But again, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't quite have an answer.
Yeah, Asta has asked a question about how privacy is different in the AI era. I think we have answered that. I've discussed that quite a bit. Yeah, Avneet has a question mostly about Namrata's point about democratic imagination of internet and how the experiment didn't pan out as well. Yeah, uh, I'm curious to know. The question is, I'm curious to know if challenging the underlying capitalist incentives behind today's internet is the only option left now. I'll read that again. I'm curious to know if challenging the underlying capitalist incentives behind today's internet is the only option left now. It is clear that co-opted states have little reason to change things. On the contrary, it is more keen to integrate AI into all sectors. This was on your
That's a great, yeah,
yeah.
got it. That's a great question. And I actually think those shifts are already happening because this reminds me of uh, so now when we have our devices and when we go anywhere, there are several places where our location is being tracked. And there was a point when there were questions around whether GPS should be opt in or opt out. And the settings that we have seen until recently or even now were a result of industry lobbying the Federal Trade Commission to say that if you shift from opt out to opt in, it will make a commercial internet unviable. And at the time, it was a convincing argument. Today, you will see that most of the conversations that we see happening around the FTC are not centered on commercialization of the internet. The utility of internet has established itself. Nobody is arguing over whether it can be commercialized, whether it should be. It has happened. The focus has shifted from just an e-commerce based or primarily e-commerce based internet to now far wider things, right? Even the FTC is talking about fundamental rights. It's talking about breaking up big tech. So and this is just the US context, but I do think that echoes and sort of is a symbol for what we're seeing in terms of the shifting narratives across the board. Regulators are looking at how they can decentralize the powers that a very few companies have got, which stand to get further entrenched with the use of AI. AI requires massive resources to collect data. Those massive resources and networks exist with a handful of companies. So it's going to get worse. So I do think those conversations are already happening, Abhineet. And there are now more avenues to talk about a different perception of accountability from those who hold so much power over the data that is circulating over the internet. We're now not looking at how do we protect these fantastic entities that are doing such great work on the internet. We're now looking at how do we best empower the people who are using this internet for commercial, personal, economic, social, a range of reasons.
Thanks. I think we have, I mean, our 1 hour time is now up. Interesting comment from Manish who says government has the voluntary in codes and mandatory in practice approach. Yeah, I definitely think that's interesting. Uh, so thanks a lot, Gus and Namrata. Wonderful discussion. Lot to think about. Yeah, lot for us all to work on. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, everyone.